What are these strange-looking objects? They look like fruits from some alien planet. Well, you might have gotten it, you might have guessed it. These are pollen grains. Pollen grains under the electron microscope. And they come in so many different shapes and sizes. As you might have guessed, we're going to be talking in this video about pollination. So welcome back to our series of videos on the topic of reproduction in plants. And in this video, we'll be looking a bit more at pollination. What is pollination? And what is self-pollination and cross-pollination? Now, just a quick reminder, we are looking at sexual reproduction in plant because we're looking at the male gamete and how it meets and how it fuses with the female gamete. Right? And of course, we recall that the male gamete is found inside the pollen grain. So we're going to take a closer look at that, and especially at this difference between self and cross-pollination. So what exactly is pollination? Well, to put it simply, it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther, which is where the pollen grains are produced, to the stigma, which is the female part of the flower. And pollination can happen through different ways. Some plants are pollinated through wind pollination. So, big wind, pollen flies around and gets trapped in the stigma of other plants. And then you also have animal pollination. An example being by bees. So here's a bee which has just stuck his face into a flower full of pollen. He needs to get a face wash now. But he's going to fly off to a different flower and pollinate that flower. We can also classify pollination in terms of whether it is self-pollination or cross-pollination. And we'll take a look at that in just a while. So if you have time, go search up this video called The Hidden Beauty of Pollination. And you'll see lots of different pollinators in action. It really is very beautiful thing that happens in nature. Otherwise, I'll show it to you in class. But here are different types of pollinators, right? Butterflies, bees, those we know very well. But did you know hummingbirds as well? And if you look at this video, you'll see a few other surprising pollinators that you might not have known about. Okay, so now we're going to get into the details. And I want to talk about the difference between self-pollination and cross-pollination. So let's start with self-pollination. Now, self-pollination, as the name suggests, it is when the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Alright, so this is case 1. Let's look at the first case first, over here. So here's a flower, right? Here's the anthers where the pollen is produced, here's the stigma. Right, self-pollination happens when the pollen from this anther is transferred to the stigma of the same flower. So this flower is self-pollinating, it's pollinating itself. So that's the first example of self-pollination. But the second example of self-pollination is as follows. So take a look again. So here's the anther. Right, and the pollen grains are being transferred from this anther to the stigma of a different flower, but on the same plant. On the same plant. Okay, so pollen is being transferred from the anther of this flower to the stigma of a flower on the same plant. So still on plant A. So this is also self-pollination, right? Because it is happening within the same plant. So it could be the same flower or between flowers on the same plant. Both are self-pollination. Now, question. Is self-pollination sexual or asexual reproduction? Think about this for a while and then continue the video. Well, you're right if you said sexual reproduction. Right? This is still sexual reproduction because it involves male gametes and female gametes fusing together. It involves pollen grains and of course the eggs inside the ovary. So this is still sexual reproduction, except that it involves only one parent plant. Right? Only one parent plant, but it is still sexual reproduction. There is still some genetic variation. Okay, even though it will be a bit less genetic variation because it is within the same parent plant. So how about cross-pollination? Well, cross-pollination, as its name suggests, is when pollen grains are transferred. Okay, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower in a different plant, right? In another plant. So for example, the anther here, the pollen is transferred to the stigma of a flower on a different plant, plant B. This is cross-pollination, across plants. And importantly, the second plant must be of the same species. Now, for example, if this anther produces pollen and it goes onto a flower of a different species, let's say like a sunflower, right? That is not counted as cross-pollination because this is a different species, so nothing will happen. This pollen cannot pollinate a flower of a different species. So this is actually an important part of the definition for cross-pollination. Alright, we now come to the slightly boring part, but it's also important and I guess good to think about. You see that there's self-pollination and cross-pollination. So what is the advantage or disadvantage of each method? Now I want you to just pause the video for a while and just spend some time reflecting. Okay, think about it. If you're a plant, would you rather have self-pollination or cross-pollination? Right, and which do you think is better? Right, so pause for a while, think about some advantages, and then continue the video. Alright, so I hope that you've had a good think about it and also prepared a table to kind of write down your notes. So self-pollination, right? One of the advantages of it is that it actually only requires one parent plant. So imagine if there's this plant that's very sad, it just grows all alone and miles away there are no other plants. Well, don't worry, this single plant itself can still reproduce sexually by self-pollination. It doesn't need another plant to reproduce. So the good thing about self-pollination is only one parent is required. Right, it's also less dependent on external factors. So imagine this plant is standing here and there's another plant over here, right? And imagine that these plants are pollinated by the wind. But then, suddenly there's a season where there's no wind. So all the pollen just drop. So sad, drop. Cannot be blown to the other plant. But that's when self-pollination is helpful. Because this plant can still pollinate itself, doesn't need much wind, or maybe all the bees died or something. It can still pollinate itself because only one parent is required. It's not so dependent on external factors if it uses self-pollination. Right, next thing is that, of course, because it is less dependent on external factors, actually less pollen, less energy, and less time are wasted. Right, because if you use cross-pollination, you kind of need to produce a lot more pollen, and hopefully, by chance, some of it will be transferred to a different plant. Right, but if you use self-pollination, which is pollinate yourself, actually, you need to use a lot less. You don't need to produce so much pollen. It doesn't take so much time because you don't need to wait for the wind or wait for some bee to come by and take your pollen to somewhere else. It's a lot faster. And of course, the next advantage is also that if the parent itself has very, very good traits. Okay, so let's imagine this is the parent plant. It's a very strong plant, and here's a very weak plant. But if you cross-pollinate, so if this plant transfers pollen to this plant, the offspring will be kind of like a medium plant, right? Not very strong, not very weak. But this parent has very beneficial traits. It's a very, very strong plant already, good traits. Then if you self-pollinate, it is able to pass on the traits to its offspring. So you get more strong plants produced as the offspring. So people in farming actually use this. So they tend to self-pollinate the certain crops which they think have better traits. They'll self-pollinate them to keep those traits, right? Now hopefully you also thought of the disadvantages. So of course the main disadvantage of self-pollination is that there's less genetic variation compared to cross-pollination. Now there's still some genetic variation, okay? It is not the same as asexual. In asexual reproduction, the offspring is exactly the same as the parent. In self-pollination is still sexual reproduction, okay? So the offspring is still different from the parent, but there's a bit less variation, right? Because it's just kind of like a rejumbling up of the parent's genes. You don't bring in the genes of another plant. So there's less genetic variation, and therefore the species might be less able to adapt when there's a sudden change in environment. Okay, besides that, if the parent plant has some harmful traits, they're also more likely to appear in the offspring. right? So it's like a double-edged sword. If the parent plant is very good, beneficial traits will be passed down, but all these harmful traits are also more likely to appear in the offspring. Right, we'll look at this in our inheritance chapter later on. Okay, they're more likely to express recessive alleles. Okay, we'll look at that next time. Don't worry if you don't understand it for now. So how about cross-pollination then? Well, it's kind of like the reverse of self-pollination. Right, so the advantages is more genetic variation. Okay, they're more able to adapt to changes in the environment. And harmful traits are less likely to appear in offspring. So if one parent plant has some harmful trait, let's say this very weak looking plant here is a harmful trait, if these two plants are crossed, then some of the offspring may not look so weak, right? Because they might get some genes from the strong parent. So the harmful traits are less likely to appear in the offspring. This is the very chim way of saying it, right? The harmful recessive alleles are less likely to be expressed as the offspring may be heterozygous. Don't care about this first. We'll revisit it again when we do our chapter on genetics and inheritance. Right, so the disadvantages of cross-pollination is that, of course, two parent plants are required. It's harder. Okay, more energy and pollen is needed. Some plants also need to spend resources on producing nectar, right, to attract insects. So that's also extra resources and energy. It's slower. It takes a longer time, right? You have to wait for the wind, animals, and it's more dependent on external factors. Okay, so that's a quick rundown of the advantages and disadvantages of the different types of pollination. Okay, so for the rest of this video, I'm going to be showing you some types of flowers that can be found in some of the plants out there. And I want you to think about whether these flowers are more likely to be self-pollinated or cross-pollinated. Alright, because some plants have evolved flowers which are more likely to self-pollinate, right, so that they can reproduce faster and etc. But other plants have evolved flowers which are more likely to cross-pollinate, right, because they would like more genetic variation and maybe they live in environments where there are more changes. So here are some examples, and I want you to think about whether or not they're more likely to self-pollinate or cross-pollinate. So let's start with this example, right? In some plants, they have bisexual flowers, so both male and female parts in one flower, and the stigma is positioned directly below the anther. So here's the stigma, here are the anthers above. So what do you think? Cross or self-pollinate? Well, you're right if you're thinking self-pollinate, right? Because if the anthers are directly above the stigma, then it's more likely for the pollen to just, drop down onto the stigma, and then you have self-pollination within the same flower. Now, how about this? In some plants, they have bisexual flowers again, but the stigmas and the anthers mature at different times. So, for example, in this example here, the flower, okay, the stigmas mature first. So when the stigmas become receptive to receive pollen, but the anthers do not yet shed pollen. And then in other plants, it's the opposite. When the anthers are shedding pollen, and they're mature already, okay, the stigmas are not ready to receive them. Okay, this is inside one flower. So what do you think? Is this one cross or self-pollination? More likely. And the answer is cross-pollination, right? Because if this was within the same flower, right, the anthers shedding pollen, but the stigma is not receptive, then this flower won't self-pollinate, right? This pollen is going to go to a different flower, more likely on a different plant to pollinate it, because it cannot pollinate the stigma of the same flower, right? It's not receptive yet. Okay, so these are some strategies that flowers have to encourage or promote cross-pollination. Alright, next, the papaya tree, dioecious plants. So these are plants with unisexual flowers on separate plants. So what do you think about this? Cross or self-pollination? And of course, the answer to this is cross-pollination, right? Because this plant, which has all female flowers, it cannot pollinate itself, right? So pollen must be transferred from the male plant, the male flower in the male plant, to the female flowers in the female plant. So this one is definitely encouraging cross-pollination. Okay, and finally, some plants have bisexual flowers that never open, right? So they just remain closed. In this case, it's encouraging self-pollination because the anthers in that flower will just pollinate the stigma in that flower. Alright, so we've reached the end of the video. We've seen what pollination is, and also what are the differences, advantages, disadvantages, and adaptations for self and cross-pollination. I'll see you.